There is a moment that almost nobody talks about. It happens right after something good. Right after the deal closes, the promotion comes through, the number hits, the goal you wrote down 18 months ago finally becomes real. It happens in the car on the way home, or in the bathroom at the office, or sitting at your kitchen table at 11 at night with the notification still glowing on your phone. The moment is this: nothing. Not relief, not pride, not the rush you imagined. Just a kind of quiet that feels wrong for the occasion. A stillness that has no business being there. You look around at your life, which by every measure you set for yourself just got better, and you feel approximately the same as you did yesterday morning. Maybe slightly tired. You shake it off. You tell yourself you'll celebrate later. You move to the next thing, and later never quite comes. If you have lived that moment, this is for you. Not because something is wrong with you, not because you are broken or ungrateful or emotionally unavailable, but because that moment, that strange, hollow silence where joy was supposed to be, is one of the most misunderstood experiences in the psychology of high performance, and almost nobody names it accurately. Most people assume it means the win wasn't big enough, so they aim higher. They raise the bar. They tell themselves that the real celebration will come when the next larger goal is reached. The promotion becomes an executive title. The revenue milestone doubles. The recognition expands. And each time the silence returns. Slightly more familiar, slightly harder to ignore. This is the delayed signal. And it has been running quietly in the background of your life, shaping decisions you thought were made from ambition, coloring relationships you thought were fine, and accumulating a cost that shows up not in your bank account or your resume, but in the part of you that wonders, usually at night, whether any of this is ever going to feel the way you thought it would. The delayed signal is not a flaw. It is a pattern. And like all patterns, it has an origin, a logic, and a cost. More importantly, it has an exit. But before we get there, we need to sit with the experience itself. Because most high-performing people have become so skilled at moving past this moment that they have never actually examined it. They have mistaken their speed for health, their productivity for peace, their next goal for a solution to a feeling they have never accurately named. So, let's name it. You are sitting somewhere, the office, your car, your home, and you have just accomplished something real, something that required effort over months, maybe years, something that cost you sleep and comfort, and probably some version of ease you gave up quietly along the way. And the world, in whatever small or large way, has acknowledged it. A number changed, a title changed, a contract was signed, a door opened, and your internal experience is flat. Not depressed, not disappointed exactly, just oddly unmoved, like watching your own life through glass. Like being present for a moment that should feel significant and finding that the signal, the emotional confirmation that something real just happened, hasn't arrived yet. That gap between the event and the feeling is what this entire exploration is about. Because here is what is true. The signal is real. The feeling is not absent permanently. It is delayed. And the reasons it is delayed, the neurological, psychological, and behavioral reasons, tell us something profound about how high performers are wired, what that wiring costs over time, and what becomes possible when the gap finally closes. There is a particular kind of person who finds their way to this topic. They are not struggling in the conventional sense. They are, by most definitions, succeeding. They are earning more than they expected at this age, or leading teams, or building something, or finally in the role they worked toward for years. From the outside, their life looks like it is working, but they clicked on this because something in the title recognized them. Something in the phrase, "rarely celebrate at the moment of winning," landed with the quiet thud of being seen. That recognition is data. It means the gap is real. It means you have been there. And it means some part of you has been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for someone to explain what is actually happening when success arrives and the celebration doesn't follow. The short answer is this: top performers don't fail to celebrate because they are emotionally deficient. They fail to celebrate because their entire system, their nervous system, their self-concept, their internal measuring stick, has been optimized for pursuit, for movement, for the next thing. Celebration requires stopping. And stopping, for the high-performing mind, triggers something that feels uncomfortably close to danger. We will get into exactly why that is. We will trace where it comes from, how it compounds across a career, and what it ultimately costs. But first, it helps to understand just how consistent this pattern is across different kinds of achievers, because you're not alone in this room, and you never were. The research on post-achievement emotional flatness is not widely discussed in popular culture. We tend to celebrate the stories of arrival, the moment the book deal came through, the morning the startup raised its round, the day the athlete crossed the finish line. We linger on those images because they are satisfying, because they confirm our belief that effort leads to reward, and reward feels like we imagine it will. But the athletes, the entrepreneurs, the executives, when asked privately, when the camera is off and the question is asked gently, many of them describe a version of that same hollow quiet, a moment of blankness where elation was supposed to be. And then, almost universally, the pivot, the already looking forward, the immediate translation of arrival into departure. The delayed signal is not rare. It is practically a signature of the high-performing mind, which means understanding it is not optional for anyone who intends to keep performing at that level without losing themselves in the process. The human brain was not designed for arrival. This is not a metaphor. It is neuroscience. The dopamine system, the network most people associate with pleasure and reward, is not actually a pleasure system. It is an anticipation system. It fires most intensely not when you get the thing, but when you are moving toward the thing. The chase, the pursuit, the narrowing distance between where you are and where you are trying to go. The moment you arrive, dopamine drops. Not gradually, not gently. It drops the way a signal drops when you walk out of range. One moment you have full bars, the next, nothing. And your brain, which has been running on that signal for months or years, suddenly finds itself in a kind of chemical silence that it has no framework for interpreting as good. This is why the morning after a major win can feel strangely grey. This is why the week following a long-anticipated vacation sometimes feels harder than the weeks of work that preceded it. This is why high performers often describe their greatest achievements in oddly muted terms, not because the achievement wasn't real, but because the neurological reward they expected was already spent in the anticipation. The brain paid for the win in advance. What arrives on the day of achievement is not the reward. It is the receipt. Now layer on top of that neurology a specific type of personality, the kind of person who has been oriented toward achievement since early in life, who learned somewhere along the way that forward motion was safe and stillness was not, who internalized the idea that the goal was not a destination but a launch pad, that arriving meant it was already time to be aiming somewhere else. For this person, the dopamine drop at the moment of winning is not just biological, it is also behavioral. They have trained themselves, through years of practice, through the positive reinforcement of results, through identity, to convert every arrival immediately into a new departure. They are so skilled at this conversion that it happens before they are conscious of it. The win registers, the internal mechanism fires, and the next target is already forming before the emotional response to the current moment has had time to develop. This is not a character flaw. For a long time it was probably adaptive. It kept them moving when others stopped. It turned setbacks into fuel. It made them resistant to complacency in a world where complacency has real consequences. In the early chapters of a career, this wiring is practically a superpower. The problem is that the brain does not distinguish between healthy forward momentum and avoidance. It cannot tell the difference between moving toward something and moving away from something. Both feel like drive, both produce output, both look from the outside like ambition. But they are not the same thing, and over time the difference matters enormously. When a high performer's constant movement is rooted in genuine excitement about what comes next, the energy is generative. It compounds. The person grows into their goals, and their goals grow with them. There is a quality of aliveness in their work that sustains them across the long distances. But when the constant movement is rooted, even partially, in an inability to be still, in a low-grade discomfort with rest, in a subtle fear of what would surface if the pace slowed, then the forward motion starts to cost more than it returns. The output continues, the results may even improve, but something underneath starts to thin. Most high performers do not notice this thinning for a long time, because they are high performers, because they are skilled at managing their internal state through external action. When something uncomfortable surfaces, they produce. When the silence feels wrong, they fill it with a new project, a new metric, a new mountain to climb. And it works in the short term. The discomfort recedes, the momentum returns, the scoreboard moves, but the emotional experience of winning never catches up. Because the mechanism that was supposed to allow the signal to land, the capacity to stop, receive, feel, acknowledge, has been quietly bypassed so many times that it has become nearly inaccessible, not broken, not gone, bypassed. Like a road that still exists on the map, but has been closed for so long that nobody remembers how to use it. There is a particular conversation that happens inside the high-performing mind in the moments after a win. It goes something like this. Yes, that happened. And now? What's next? The "and now" arrives so quickly, so automatically, so seamlessly, that the "yes, that happened" barely has time to register as a full sentence before it is already past tense. The acknowledgement is there. It is just moving at a speed that makes feeling impossible. Think about what that means across a career. Imagine 10 years of wins processed at that speed. Promotions, milestones, breakthroughs, relationships that grew, skills that compounded, moments that objectively constituted a life being built with intention and effort. All of it processed in transit. All of it converted immediately into fuel for the next leg of the journey. What you would have at the end of those 10 years is an impressive resume and a strange sense of emptiness that has no logical explanation. Because by every external measure, the life worked. The goals were hit. The trajectory was real. But the experience of living that life, the felt sense of it, the emotional texture of it, would be thin, like a meal you ate too fast to taste. This is not hypothetical. This is the private interior of a very large number of successful people. People who, from the outside, appear to have everything arranged correctly, who have built what they set out to build, who are, by any reasonable standard, winning, and who sit sometimes in quiet rooms wondering why it doesn't feel like more. The answer is not that they chose the wrong goals. The answer is not that success is a lie or that ambition is misguided. The answer is simpler and more specific than that. The signal was sent. It just never fully landed. And understanding why it didn't land, understanding the precise mechanism that intercepts it, is the first step toward changing the experience of a life that, in almost every other way, is already working. Every high performer carries an invisible scoreboard. It is not the scoreboard other people see, not the title on the email signature, not the revenue number, not the performance review, not the LinkedIn milestone that collects congratulations from people you haven't spoken to in years. Those are external scoreboards. They matter to the people around you. They are real in their own way. But the internal scoreboard is different. It is the one you actually play against. The one that was running long before anyone else was paying attention. The one that does not reset when you win, does not applaud when you hit a target, and does not lower its standards simply because you worked hard to meet the previous one. The internal scoreboard is ruthless, not because it is cruel, but because it is yours. Because it was built from your specific history, your specific comparisons, your specific version of what enough looks like. And for most high performers, that scoreboard was calibrated early and calibrated high in response to something that had very little to do with professional achievement. Some people built their internal scoreboard in response to a parent whose approval arrived conditionally, if it arrived at all. Some built it in a household where resources were uncertain and achievement felt like the most reliable path to safety. Some built it in a school or a community where they were the one who was supposed to make it, where carrying the hopes of a family or a neighborhood quietly became part of their identity before they were old enough to choose it. The specifics vary. The structure is consistent. What gets built, in all of these cases, is a standard that exists just beyond reach, Not impossibly far, just far enough. Far enough that you always have to stretch. Far enough that arriving never quite triggers the sense of having cleared it. Because the scoreboard, almost by design, adjusts upward the moment you get close. This is not pathology. In its early form, it was protection. It was the internal architecture of a person who learned that complacency had consequences, that the gap between where you are and where you need to be is a dangerous place to linger. The scoreboard kept you moving, it kept you sharp, it made you harder to stop. But here is what nobody tells you about a scoreboard that never lets you win. You stop expecting to win, not consciously, not in any way you would admit out loud, but somewhere in the operating system of your behavior, a quiet update gets installed. The update says, the point is not arrival. The point is movement. Arrival is a myth, or at best, a brief way station. And so you stop preparing emotionally for the experience of winning. You stop building the internal space where celebration would live, because on some level you have accepted that the feeling you are chasing will always be one goal ahead of wherever you currently are. This has a very specific effect on how success is processed in real time. When the win arrives, the real one, the one that cost you something, the one that was not guaranteed, your internal system does not recognize it as the signal to stop and receive. It recognizes it as confirmation that the system works, that the engine is functioning, that you should keep going. The win becomes evidence of capacity, not an experience to inhabit. Other people celebrate your win more fully than you do. You notice this sometimes. The people around you seem more excited than you feel. Your team, your partner, your friends, they respond to your achievement with a warmth and expansiveness that you observe almost from a distance. You appreciate it. You might even perform some version of celebration for their benefit. But inside, the moment passes quickly, and privately, you wonder if something is missing in you. It is not. What is missing is the permission structure, the internal authorization to let the win be the win, without immediately converting it into evidence for the next argument you are making to yourself about what comes next. There is also something else operating here that is worth naming directly. The internal scoreboard, for many high performers, is comparative. It is not just set against an abstract standard of excellence. It is set against specific people. A sibling who seemed to have things easier, a colleague who got further faster, a version of yourself at a younger age who made a promise you are still trying to keep, a peer from school or early career whose trajectory you have tracked, consciously or not, for longer than you would admit. These comparisons are not petty, they are human, but they create a particular problem. They make your wins conditional on someone else's position. You cannot fully register your achievement because you are simultaneously measuring it against a reference point that is outside your control. If the comparison point moves, if the colleague gets promoted, if the peer's company raises a larger round, your win shrinks in your own accounting, even though nothing about the win itself changed. This is the scoreboard eating its own signal. Your achievement was real, the effort was real, the result was real. But because the internal measuring system was calibrated against an external reference that shifted, the confirmation you were waiting for never arrives in full. And so you aim higher. You adjust the target, you tell yourself that you'll feel it when the gap is wider, when the achievement is undeniable, when the comparison no longer stacks up in anyone's favor but yours. This is one of the quietest and most expensive loops in the psychology of ambition, because the comparison never resolves in the way you are hoping it will. Not because you are not capable enough, but because the game is structured to prevent resolution. You are using an external variable to calibrate an internal experience. And external variables do not have the authority to close internal gaps. They never did. They never will. The scoreboard that was built to protect you has become the thing that stands between you and the experience of your own life. Recognizing that is not defeat. It is the beginning of something far more useful than another goal. There is something that high performers almost never say out loud. Celebrating feels dangerous, not in a dramatic way, not in any way that would show up in a conversation or a therapy session or a quiet moment of honest reflection. It is more subtle than that. It is a low-level signal below the threshold of conscious thought that says, if you stop here, something bad might happen. If you let yourself feel this fully, you might lose the edge that got you here. If you open up to the joy of this moment, you are exposing yourself to something you cannot afford to be exposed to. The something is loss. More specifically, it is the fear that this moment, this win, this achievement, this evidence that the effort was worth it, might be the high point. That from here, the graph goes flat, or worse. That celebrating means acknowledging you have arrived at a peak, and acknowledging a peak means confronting the possibility of descent. This is not irrational. Peaks are real. Careers have arcs. Industries shift. The things that made someone successful in one era do not automatically transfer to the next. High performers know this. They have watched it happen to others. They have studied the cautionary examples. And somewhere in the processing of all that information, a quiet rule got written into their operating system. Never get comfortable. Never signal, even to yourself, that you are satisfied. Because satisfaction is the beginning of the end. So they keep moving, they keep the bar high, they keep the celebration small or absent. Not because they don't feel the win somewhere underneath all of it, but because feeling it fully seems like a risk they cannot calculate accurately enough to take. There is also a second layer to this that is harder to articulate, but equally real. Celebration is public, even when it is private. It is a declaration. It says, "This mattered. This was real. I did this." And for the high performer who has built their identity on a particular kind of forward-leaning humility, the kind that is always pointing to the next goal, always crediting the team, always situating the current win as merely a step towards something larger, a full-throated celebration feels almost unseemly. Like it violates a code they have been living by for so long, they have forgotten they chose it. The code sounds something like this. Real performers don't rest on their accomplishments. Real performers are never satisfied. Real performers use every win as fuel, not as a destination. This code is not entirely wrong. There is something in it that is genuinely useful. The problem is that it has been applied without nuance, without seasons, without the understanding that the same rule that serves you in the climb can quietly hollow you out over years of application. Because here is what the code does not account for. The human nervous system was not designed to perform indefinitely in a state of unsatisfied forward motion. It was designed to cycle, to move and then rest, to pursue and then receive, to extend and then restore. The rhythm of effort and recovery is not a luxury, it is a biological requirement. And when you override it consistently, when you train yourself to convert every recovery moment into another launch, you are not beating the system. You are borrowing against it. The debt is not visible immediately. That is what makes it so easy to ignore. In the first years of applying this approach, the returns are real. You outwork people who rest too easily. You maintain momentum through difficulties that derail others. You build a track record that compounds and opens doors. The code appears to be working exactly as advertised. But something is also happening underneath the surface. The capacity for genuine enthusiasm quietly erodes. The things that used to excite you about your work start to require more effort to access. The projects that once felt electric start to feel merely important. The wins that used to produce at least a brief flicker of satisfaction now produce primarily a checklist item completed and a new one added. This is not burnout in the classic sense. Burnout is a collapse. This is something slower and more insidious. It is a gradual narrowing of the emotional bandwidth available for your own life, a slow migration from participant to manager. You are no longer inside your wins, you are administering them. And the fear that drove the avoidance of celebration in the first place, the fear of the peak, the fear of descent, does not go away when you keep moving. It relocates. It finds a new home in the background of everything, a persistent hum that more goals and more achievements cannot silence because it was never actually about the goals. It was about the exposure. The vulnerability of caring enough about something to admit that getting it mattered. Celebration, at its core, is an act of admission. It says, I wanted this. I cared about this outcome. This result has meaning to me. For the high performer who has learned, through experience or through early conditioning, that expressing what you want is dangerous, that caring too visibly is a liability, that the safest version of ambition is the one that stays slightly detached from its own outcomes. Celebration is not just emotionally challenging, it is structurally threatening to the identity they have built. Because if you admit that this win mattered, you also admit that the next one might not come. You admit that the effort could have failed. You admit that the outcome was not entirely in your control, and that the gap between what you worked for and what you received could have gone the other way. That admission is the thing the forward motion was designed to prevent. And so the cycle continues. Win, deflect, move, win again, deflect again, move again. Until something, a conversation, a quiet moment, a loss that recalibrates everything, or simply the accumulated weight of years spent sprinting past your own life, finally makes the cost of the cycle impossible to keep ignoring. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. You have probably felt it. It is not the tiredness that comes from a hard week or a difficult project or a season of overcommitment that you can see the end of. It is deeper than that. It sits below the level of schedule and workload. It is present even after the vacation, even after the long weekend, even after the rare morning when you woke up without an alarm and let yourself stay horizontal until your body decided it was done. It is still there, quiet, patient, unbothered by rest. This tiredness has a specific origin. It is the accumulated weight of years spent processing your life at a speed that does not allow for full emotional registration. It is what happens when win after win, milestone after milestone, year after year, the signal gets sent but never fully received. When the moment of achievement passes through your system like light through glass, present for an instant, leaving no warmth behind. The body keeps a different kind of account than the mind does. The mind can rationalize the pace. It can construct excellent arguments for why this season is particularly demanding, why the current stretch requires everything, why the time to slow down and feel things is coming. Just not yet, just not now, just after this next thing resolves. The mind is very good at this. It has had years of practice, but the body does not rationalize. It accumulates. Every bypass celebration is a small withdrawal from an account that was never designed to run at a deficit indefinitely. Every converted moment of arrival, every win immediately translated into a new departure without being inhabited first, costs something that does not show up immediately on any ledger you can read. It shows up later. It shows up as the flatness, as the narrowing enthusiasm, as the increasing difficulty of accessing genuine excitement about things that would have lit you up 5 years ago. It shows up as the faint, persistent question that visits high performers in the quiet hours. Is this all there is? That question is not ingratitude. It is not weakness. It is the sound of a system asking for what it has not been given. It is the delayed signal, accumulated across years, arriving all at once in the form of a feeling that has no clean name and no obvious solution. Most people, when this feeling arrives, respond the way they have always responded. They set a bigger goal. They find a new challenge. They interpret the flatness as evidence that the current chapter has run its course, and what they need is a new one. More stimulation, more novelty, a different industry, a different company, a different relationship, a different city. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes a genuine change of direction is exactly what is needed. But sometimes, more often than most people are willing to consider, the flatness is not about the chapter. It is about the reader. The environment did not cause the disconnection. The pattern did. And taking the pattern into a new environment produces, with remarkable reliability, the same result in a new location. This is one of the most expensive mistakes in the psychology of high performance, not because ambition is wrong and not because change is never the answer, but because mistaking a psychological pattern for an environmental problem sends you on a search that cannot succeed. You are looking for the feeling in a new job, a new market, a new relationship, a new city, when the feeling was never located there. It was located in the moment you kept skipping. The compounding cost of skipped joy is not dramatic. That is precisely what makes it so difficult to track. A single bypassed celebration is nothing. 2 bypassed celebrations are nothing. A year of them is a slight thinning of something you might not even notice yet. But 5 years of them, 10 years of them, a career built on the consistent practice of converting arrival into departure without pausing to inhabit the space between, that is a different kind of math. That is a ledger that eventually demands attention whether you chose to open it or not. And the demand does not always arrive in a form that is easy to recognize as what it is. It arrives as restlessness that has no clear object, as a low tolerance for stillness that you justify with productivity, as a subtle disconnection from the people closest to you who can sense, even if they cannot articulate, that you are always slightly elsewhere, present in the room, but already 3 steps down the road in your head. It arrives as a creeping suspicion, which you quickly suppress, that the version of yourself who started this journey had a quality of aliveness that the current version has traded for competence. That somewhere along the way, you became very good at this life without remaining fully inside it. There is a particular conversation that high performers have with themselves around this point in the realization. It is the conversation that begins, "But look at what I have built. Look at what I have accomplished. Look at the evidence that the approach worked." And that conversation is not wrong. The evidence is real. The accomplishments are real. The life that was built is real and worth something. But built for whom? Experienced by whom? If the person who built it was never quite present for the building, if every floor of the structure was completed and immediately converted into a foundation for the next floor without ever being inhabited, then the building exists, but the life inside it is strangely thin. This is not a reason for regret. Regret is another form of the same avoidance, another way of not being present, just aimed backward instead of forward. This is, instead, a reason for a specific kind of attention, a recalibration, a decision to begin receiving what is being built, not just constructing it. Because the account is not closed, the capacity for the signal to land is not gone. It has been bypassed, not destroyed. And the distance between bypassed and accessible is shorter than it feels from the inside of a life that has been moving too fast to notice what it has been missing. Something needs to be reframed before we go further. The delayed signal, the gap between winning and feeling it, between achieving and receiving, has been treated, throughout most of this conversation, as a problem. A cost, a pattern with consequences that accumulate quietly over time. And all of that is true. The cost is real. The pattern matters. But there is another way to read the signal, a way that does not contradict what has come before but deepens it, a way that, if you can hold it alongside the cost, changes the emotional texture of the whole experience. The delayed signal is not only a symptom of avoidance, it is also a symptom of scale. Here is what that means. When a child learns to walk and takes their first unassisted steps, the celebration in the room is immediate and enormous. The adults go wild. The child, slightly bewildered, grins at the response. The signal lands instantly because the event is simple, the stakes are clear, and the emotional circuitry involved is uncomplicated. But as the scale of a person's goals increases, as the distance between where they started and where they are trying to go lengthens, as the complexity of the work deepens, as the timeline stretches from weeks to years to decades, the relationship between event and feeling necessarily changes. The wins get larger and simultaneously more abstract. The achievement of a 10-year goal cannot be processed by the same emotional circuitry that handles a gold star on a homework assignment. The nervous system, quite literally, does not have a ready-made response for certain levels of accomplishment. The event is too large, too layered, too entangled with sacrifice and time and identity for a clean, immediate emotional response to form. The signal has to travel further, through more history, through more complexity, through a self that has been fundamentally changed by the process of achieving the thing. This is not failure. This is the natural consequence of playing a long game. The people who feel their wins immediately and completely tend to be playing shorter games, smaller scales, more immediate feedback loops. There is nothing wrong with that. But it is a different kind of pursuit. The person who is building something over years, whose goal exists at a scale that most people around them cannot fully see or understand, should not expect their emotional response to that goal to function like a short-term feedback loop. It was never designed to. The delayed signal in this light is almost a marker of depth, of the distance the work has traveled, of how much of yourself was required to get here. This does not mean the bypass is healthy. It does not mean the avoidance is serving you. The distinction matters. There is a difference between a signal that is delayed because the work was vast and the self has to catch up to what it accomplished, and a signal that is delayed because a protective mechanism has been intercepting it for years. Both produce the same surface experience, the hollow quiet after the win. But they have different roots and different implications. The first kind of delay resolves on its own, given space and time, and the deliberate decision to stop moving long enough for the signal to arrive. The second kind requires something more intentional. It requires going back to the mechanism and understanding what it is protecting, what it is afraid of, and whether that fear is still relevant to the life you are currently living. Most high performers are experiencing some combination of both. The delay is partly scale. The work was genuinely vast, the self genuinely needs time to catch up, and it is partly protection. There is something in the operating system that has been intercepting the signal before it can land fully, for reasons that made sense once and may not anymore. Untangling those two threads is important, because the response to each is different. For the delay rooted in scale, the response is permission. Permission to let the signal travel at its own pace. Permission to understand that not feeling the win immediately does not mean the win was insufficient or that you are emotionally broken. It means the work was serious. It means the goal was real. And the feeling, when it comes, sometimes days later, sometimes months later, sometimes in a quiet moment years down the road when you are doing something entirely unrelated, will have a quality to it that the immediate response never could. A depth, a resonance, a sense of finally receiving something that was always yours. For the delay rooted in protection, the response is curiosity, not judgment, not urgency. Curiosity about the mechanism. What is it protecting? What does it believe will happen if the signal lands fully? What early experience taught it that receiving was dangerous, that arrival was unsafe, that the moment of acknowledgement was a moment of exposure? These are not questions to answer in a single sitting. They are questions to carry, to notice, to bring into the moments that follow a win, when the hollow quiet arrives and the familiar impulse to move immediately surfaces. What if, instead of moving, you paused? Not forever, not even for long. Just long enough to ask, what would it feel like to let this land? The question itself is the beginning of something. Not a solution, not a fix, a direction. A slight loosening of the mechanism that has been running on automatic for so long that it no longer requires your permission to operate. And here is what most people discover when they begin to ask that question seriously. The thing they were afraid of, the exposure, the vulnerability, the dangerous softness of letting a win matter, is not as threatening as the mechanism believed. The fear was calibrated for an earlier version of life, for a context that no longer exists, for a self that needed that protection in a way the current self simply does not. The signal was never broken. It was waiting for conditions that felt safe enough to arrive. And those conditions are something you have more power to create than you may have understood until now. There is a question that cuts through almost everything else in this conversation, and it is not a comfortable one. The question is this: what is actually driving you? Not what you tell people at networking events, not the clean narrative you have constructed about purpose and impact and the legacy you are building. Those things may be true. They probably contain real truth. But underneath the narrative, underneath the goals and the metrics and the forward motion, there is a source. And the source matters enormously, not because it changes what you do, but because it determines what the doing costs you and what it is capable of giving back. There are two fundamental sources of high performance. They look almost identical from the outside. They produce similar resumes, similar income trajectories, similar levels of external recognition. You can sit across from two people at a dinner table, both successful by every measurable standard, and have no idea which source is powering each of them. The outputs are that similar, but the internal experience is completely different. And over the long arc of a career and a life, the difference compounds into something that cannot be ignored. The first source is drive. Drive is generative. It is rooted in genuine desire, the real embodied pull towards something that matters to you, that excites something in you that was there before anyone told you it should be there. Drive says, I want to build this, because building it feels like the most alive version of what I could be doing with my time. It is connected to curiosity, to craft, to the specific pleasure of getting better at something you actually care about. Drive can sustain a career. It can sustain a life. It has a quality of renewal to it. The more you follow it, the more it generates. It is not unlimited, and it requires tending, but it is fundamentally regenerative. The work feeds the worker. The second source is hunger. And hunger is different. Hunger is not rooted in desire. It is rooted in deficit, in the specific persistent feeling that something is missing, something is not yet enough, something about the current version of yourself or your life is insufficient in a way that achievement might fix. Hunger is powered not by the pull towards something, but by the push away from something. Away from a version of yourself you cannot tolerate, away from a fear you cannot sit with, away from a memory or a wound, or an old story about who you are that you have been outrunning since before you knew that was what you were doing. Hunger is also a powerful engine. In many ways, it is more powerful than drive in the short term. It is relentless. It does not require inspiration. It does not depend on enthusiasm or excitement or the presence of meaning. It runs on necessity, on the deep, wordless conviction that stopping is not safe, that enough is not real, that the moment you allow yourself to feel satisfied is the moment the floor drops out. Hunger built many of the most impressive careers in history. It has a legitimate role in the story of human achievement. But hunger cannot be fed. That is its defining characteristic. That is the thing that distinguishes it most clearly from drive, and that makes it, over the long arc, so quietly devastating. Drive can be satisfied, temporarily, seasonally, in the way that a good meal satisfies hunger, knowing you will be hungry again, but feeling genuinely full for now. Drive allows for the experience of enough, even if enough is not permanent. It allows for the moments of arrival, the periods of genuine satisfaction, the ability to look at what you have built and feel something real about it. Hunger cannot be satisfied because it was never actually about the goal. The goal was a proxy, a stand-in for something that the goal was never equipped to deliver. You were not actually chasing the promotion. You were chasing the feeling of being undeniable, of having finally proven something to someone, of reaching a place where the old fear, the one that said you were not enough, would finally be silent. But the fear is not located in the promotion. It is located in you. And so when the promotion arrives, the fear remains, the hunger remains. And the only available response within the logic of that system is a larger goal, a higher bar, a new proxy for the thing that was never going to be found in the external world. This is the loop, and it is the loop that explains, more than anything else, why the delayed signal becomes a permanent condition for some people. Not because the signal is structurally incapable of landing, but because the system was never actually oriented toward receiving it. It was oriented toward the next pursuit. Always, by design. Because receiving, actually landing, actually arriving, actually feeling the fullness of what was built, would disrupt the hunger. And the hunger, for all the pain it carries, is also familiar. It is the engine the whole identity was built around. Letting it quiet, even for a moment, feels like losing the thing that made you who you are. This is the deepest layer of the pattern, the place where the bypass is not just behavioral, but existential, and it requires something that goal setting cannot provide. It requires the willingness to ask honestly, if I already had the feeling I am chasing, if I woke up tomorrow and the deficit was gone, not because I achieved my way out of it, but because I genuinely no longer felt insufficient, would I still want the things I am currently pursuing? For some people, the answer is yes, fully, clearly, without hesitation. And that yes is drive. That is the clean signal of genuine desire. For others, the answer is more complicated. There is a pause, a flicker of uncertainty, a quiet recognition that some of what they are building is for them, and some of it is for a version of themselves that still believes arrival will finally deliver the silence they have been working toward. That recognition is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to look more carefully at what you are actually building and for whom. At some point, the question stops being why and starts being how. Not how to achieve more, not how to optimize the system or increase the output or build a better version of the forward motion that has carried you this far, but how to receive what is already here, how to close the gap, not between where you are and where you are going, but between what you have built and your actual experience of having built it. This is quieter work than most high performers are accustomed to. It does not produce a deliverable. It does not show up on a performance review. It cannot be tracked on a dashboard or converted into a metric that other people can verify. It is entirely internal, entirely personal, and entirely resistant to the kind of effort that high performers are most comfortable applying, which is exactly why it tends to be the last thing they address, if they address it at all. The skill of receiving, of allowing achievement to land as a real felt experience rather than a data point to be processed and filed, is not taught in any environment that produces high performers, not in elite universities, not in competitive corporate cultures, not in the startup ecosystems that celebrate speed and scale above almost everything else. The entire architecture of those environments is oriented toward production, not reception, toward the next output, not the current one. And so most high performers arrive at their 30s and 40s having developed extraordinary capacity in almost every domain that was rewarded: strategy, execution, resilience, communication, leadership, and almost no capacity in the one domain that was never mentioned: the domain of simply being present for your own life. This is not a soft observation, it has hard consequences. The capacity to receive is not separate from the capacity to perform, it is upstream of it. The person who can genuinely inhabit their wins, who can let the signal land, feel the weight of what was accomplished, acknowledge the cost and the effort and the specific version of themselves that made it possible, that person has access to something that the perpetual mover does not. They have access to accurate feedback. Not the external feedback of metrics and reviews, but the internal feedback of genuine satisfaction and genuine dissatisfaction. The ability to feel when something is working not just in the spreadsheet, but in the self. The ability to notice when a path is right, not because it is producing results, but because it is producing a quality of aliveness that sustains rather than drains. This internal feedback system is the most reliable navigation tool available to a high performer, and it requires reception to function. It requires the willingness to stop long enough to feel what is actually present, rather than immediately converting the present into preparation for the future. Learning to receive is not passive. That is the misunderstanding that makes high performers resist it. It feels like stopping, like giving up the edge, like trading the tension that drives performance for a comfort that softens it. But genuine reception is not comfort. It is clarity. It is the difference between running towards something and running with full knowledge of why you are running and what it means to you. The second runner is not slower. They are more precise. They waste less. They sustain longer. And when they arrive, they actually know they have arrived. There are specific practices that open the capacity for reception, not rituals in the performative sense, not gratitude journaling as a checkbox or meditation as a productivity hack. Something more fundamental than any specific practice: a shift in orientation. The shift is this: from managing your experience to inhabiting it. Managing your experience is what the high-performing mind does by default. It monitors, adjusts, optimizes. It keeps the internal state within a range that supports continued output. It is efficient, and it is skilled, and it keeps the machine running. But it maintains a slight distance from the actual felt quality of living. It is supervision, not presence. Inhabiting your experience is different. It means allowing the full texture of a moment to register, not just the information content of it, but the felt sense of it. The specific quality of a win that came after a long struggle. The particular weight of a morning when you look at what you have built and let it be real for a moment before you start thinking about what comes next. This does not require hours. It does not require a retreat or a significant lifestyle change or a therapeutic process, though none of those things are wrong. It requires a decision made repeatedly to pause at the threshold of arrival and let the moment complete itself before beginning the next one. The threshold is the key. Most high performers are so skilled at transitioning, at moving from one mode to the next, one goal to the next, one season to the next, that they have essentially eliminated the threshold. The transition is instantaneous. The arrival and the new departure are a single motion. What the capacity for reception asks for is the restoration of the threshold as a real space. A moment, not a day, not a week, just a genuine moment of conscious arrival. Of saying with some specificity what just happened, what it cost, what it means, not to anyone else, to yourself. This specificity matters. The high-performing mind is comfortable with abstraction. It can acknowledge a win in general terms indefinitely without actually feeling it. What breaks through the abstraction is specificity. The specific thing you were afraid of that did not happen. The specific version of yourself 2 years ago who did not know if this was possible. The specific moment during the hardest stretch when you nearly redirected your efforts somewhere safer and chose not to. Those specifics are where the signal lives, and when you bring deliberate attention to them, not to perform gratitude, but to genuinely locate the experience of what happened, the signal begins to land in a way it never could when you were moving too fast to address it with that kind of precision. The gap closes slowly, and then, one day, not slowly at all. There is a person worth telling you about, not a specific individual. No single story belongs here, but a composite, a portrait assembled from the recognizable pattern of a particular kind of journey that enough people have taken that it has its own shape, its own texture, its own specific turning point. Call them Alex. The name does not matter, the pattern does. Alex spent the first decade of their career building at a pace that impressed almost everyone around them. Promotions came ahead of schedule. Income grew in ways that younger colleagues noticed and older ones respected. The external markers of a career working correctly were all present and accounted for. Alex was, by every available measure, succeeding, and Alex felt almost nothing about it. Not nothing in a clinical sense, not a flatness that interfered with functioning or raised flags in any conversation. Just the specific, familiar hollowness of wins processed too quickly to be felt. The promotion acknowledged, the team congratulated, the dinner reservation made, the bottle of wine opened, and underneath all of it, a quiet that had no business being there. Alex knew the pattern, had known it for years, in the way you know something without having named it. The knowing lived in the body more than the mind, in the slight tightening when someone asked how it felt to have hit the milestone, in the brief reflexive pivot to what came next whenever a conversation lingered too long on what was just accomplished, in the mild but persistent sense, present in the background of most days, that the life being built was somehow slightly adjacent to the life being lived. The turn did not come from a crisis. There was no breakdown, no dramatic loss, no single event that forced the reckoning. It came from something smaller and in some ways more difficult to dismiss. Alex was at dinner with someone who had known them since before the career began. A friend from a time when the ambition was still forming, when the goals were still abstract, when the version of success being pursued had not yet calcified into a specific shape. And this friend, with no agenda and no particular insight into psychology, asked a simple question: do you enjoy any of this? Not as a challenge, not as a critique, just as a genuine, curious question from someone who cared enough to ask it directly. Alex started to answer the way the question had always been answered. Of course, it is challenging and rewarding, and the team is great, and the trajectory is exciting. The answer was true. It was also completely beside the point of what was asked. The friend waited, and in the waiting, in the small, patient silence that followed the automatic answer, Alex heard the question again, not as words, as a mirror. Do you enjoy any of this? The honest answer, when it finally formed, was not no. It was not yes either. It was something more specific and more uncomfortable. The honest answer was, I do not know. I have been moving so fast for so long that I genuinely cannot tell you what I enjoy and what I endure. I cannot tell you which parts of this life I chose and which parts I simply built because building was what I knew how to do. That moment, not the crisis, not the breakdown, but the quiet, honest answer to a simple question, was the beginning of something different. What followed was not a dramatic reinvention. Alex did not quit, did not pivot, did not dismantle the life that had been constructed over a decade of serious effort. The external structure remained largely intact. What changed was the relationship to it, the orientation from inside it. The first change was the simplest and the strangest. Alex started finishing moments before beginning the next ones, not ceremonially, not with any elaborate ritual or prescribed practice, just a decision made repeatedly and imperfectly to let a thing be complete before treating it as a launchpad. To sit with a win, even briefly, even awkwardly, before converting it into evidence for the next argument about what to pursue. It felt wrong at first, uncomfortably still, like a muscle being asked to do something it had not done in so long that the request felt like a foreign language. The familiar pull toward the next thing was immediate and strong. The internal voice that said yes, but what about, was loud and persuasive and had a very good track record of being listened to. But Alex kept returning to the threshold, kept practicing the pause, kept asking, with increasing specificity, what just happened here? And what does it actually mean to me? And slowly, not linearly, not without resistance, not in any way that would make a satisfying before and after story, the signal began to land differently, not louder, not more dramatic, just more present, more real, more connected to the actual texture of the life being lived, rather than the abstracted metrics of the life being managed. The wins did not get bigger. The goals did not get smaller. The ambition did not dissolve into contentment. Alex remained exactly the kind of person who sets serious targets and pursues them seriously. But something in the quality of the pursuit shifted. The movement began to feel less like escape and more like direction. Less like outrunning something and more like moving toward something that was genuinely, clearly wanted. The hunger was still there. But it had begun, slowly, to be accompanied by something else. Something that the hunger had been crowding out for years without Alex realizing it was even present. Genuine desire. The clean, specific, embodied pull toward things that mattered not because they would prove something, but because they were worth doing on their own terms. The scoreboard did not disappear. But it became slightly more legible, slightly more honest, slightly more aligned with the actual values of the person standing in front of it, rather than the fears of the person who had built it years ago in a different life. That shift, quiet, incremental, resistant to clean summary, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different quality of story, one where the person living it is actually present for the living. You have been carrying something for a long time, not a burden exactly, not something that has stopped you or broken you or kept you from building what you set out to build. You have built it. The evidence is real. The effort was genuine. The distance between where you started and where you are standing right now is a distance that most people never travel, and you traveled it on your own terms, in your own time, with your own particular combination of discipline and stubbornness and quiet refusal to accept the ceiling that other people were comfortable with. But you have been carrying it while slightly outside yourself, moving through the construction of your life with the focused efficiency of someone who cannot afford to be slowed by the full weight of what they are doing. Feeling the wins partially, receiving the moments incompletely, living at a pace that kept the signal perpetually in transit, perpetually just behind you, perpetually almost arrived. The delayed signal was not a malfunction. This is the thing that needs to be said clearly and held without immediately converting it into something more useful or more actionable than it actually is. The delayed signal was the appropriate response of a system that was asked to carry something large across a long distance in conditions that did not always feel safe. It was the logical output of a mind that learned early and learned well, that forward motion was the most reliable form of protection available. That arrival was dangerous, that stillness was exposure, that the moment of completion was also, always, the moment of maximum vulnerability. That learning was not wrong. It was not a mistake or a deficiency or a trauma response that needs to be corrected before you can proceed with your life. It was adaptive. It was intelligent. It was exactly the right tool for the context in which it was developed. The context has changed. That is all. The tool that protected you in one chapter is simply not the tool that will serve you in the next one. Not because you are broken, but because you have grown past the conditions that required it. The signal was never late. This is the reframe that the whole journey has been building toward, and it deserves to be held without rushing past it. Every win you could not feel in the moment it happened, every achievement that passed through you like light through glass, leaving less warmth than it should have, was still real, was still yours. The feeling did not arrive on schedule, but the meaning was accumulating. The life was being built, the self was being shaped. And somewhere in the ledger that the body keeps, separate from the mind's official account, everything that happened was being recorded. The signal was in transit, not lost, not cancelled, not evidence of insufficiency or emotional deficiency or a life being lived incorrectly, in transit, moving through a system that was not yet ready to receive it at full volume, for reasons that made complete sense at the time. And here is what transit means. It arrives eventually, not automatically, not without your participation, but eventually, when the conditions change, when the mechanism that was intercepting it is seen clearly enough that it loosens its grip, when the person on the receiving end has become, through time and honest attention, someone who can hold what is coming without immediately converting it into fuel for the next departure. You are that person now, or you are becoming that person. The fact that you have stayed with this, that this conversation found something in you worth finding, that the recognition arrived not as a comfortable validation, but as a real and slightly uncomfortable homecoming, that is not nothing. That is data about who you currently are and what you are currently capable of receiving. The question that remains is not whether the signal will land. It will. It already is, in the way that realizations land, not all at once, not with the drama of a sudden conversion, but gradually and then suddenly, the way light changes in a room. When someone finally opens the curtains they forgot were closed. The question is what you do at the threshold. Not every threshold, not as a practice to be executed with the same discipline you bring to your professional life. Just the next one. The next win, large or small. The next moment of completion that your system will immediately try to convert into a new beginning. The next time the hollow quiet arrives and the familiar impulse to move surfaces. What if you paused there? Not to analyze, not to journal or process or extract a lesson, just to pause, to let the moment be real for a breath longer than it has ever been allowed to be. To say, internally and without performance, this happened. I did this. It cost something real. It means something real. And I am going to let it mean that, for a moment, before I decide what comes next. That pause is not weakness. It is not the end of the drive or the softening of the ambition or the first step toward a smaller life. It is the opposite. It is the act of a person who has enough confidence in their own forward motion to stop briefly without fearing they will never start again. It is the act of someone who has finally understood that the signal was never the enemy of performance. It was the reward that performance was always generating, waiting patiently for the moment when the person generating it was finally ready to receive it. The high performers who last, who build across decades without hollowing out, who arrive at the later chapters of their careers and lives with something genuine still intact, are not the ones who never felt the delayed signal. They felt it. They lived it. Many of them spent years inside the same pattern described in every section of this conversation. What separated them was a single decision, made at some threshold to let the moment land. Not to stop, not to settle, not to mistake arrival for finality, just to receive what was already theirs. You have been building something real. You have been someone worth becoming. The signal has been traveling the whole time, and the distance it still has to cover is shorter than you think. There is a particular quality of evening that belongs specifically to people who have spent years moving fast. It arrives quietly, usually when nothing extraordinary is happening. You are somewhere ordinary, a kitchen, a porch, A car parked in a driveway at the end of a day that was not especially significant. And something in the quality of the light, or the stillness, or the simple fact of having nowhere to be for exactly this moment, opens something that the pace normally keeps closed. You feel, briefly and without warning, the full weight of the life you have built, not as a burden, as a presence, as the accumulated reality of choices made and distances traveled and mornings when you got up anyway and kept going, even when going was the harder option. That feeling, unannounced, unhurried, arriving precisely when you were not performing for anyone, including yourself. That is the signal landing. It was never delayed because you were doing something wrong. It was delayed because you were doing something hard, and hard things take time to become real, not just in the world, but in the person who made them happen. The pause you give it, the breath you allow it, the quiet moment of acknowledgement before the world starts again, is not a small thing. It is perhaps the most important thing, because it is the moment when the life you built and the life you are living finally occupy the same space. And in that space, something that has been in transit for a very long time finally, quietly, comes home.